For some composers, writing 52 cues a year or just one cue per week might feel like a heavy lift. For other composers, writing one cue per day is par for the course. So, how much output do we really need? Which begs the question, what about quality versus quantity? Well, we're going to talk about that as well as listen to one of your tension cues submitted by the 5-2 family on this week's 52 Cues podcast. What is happening, everybody? This is Dave Croft, and welcome back to another episode of the 52 Cues podcast, a podcast looking to educate, to inspire, to motivate working composers just like yourself. Thank you so much for joining me. I'm glad you found me, however you found me. And before we get started, I also want to give a special word of thanks to my Patreon patrons whose support helps keep everything going here. Lots more about my Patreon at the end of today's episode. And today's topic is about output and quality versus quantity. And then a little bit later, we're going to listen to one of your cues, a cue submitted by a member of the 52 Cues family over at the 52 Cues Facebook group, Angel Jimenez. He submitted a tension cue called Caravan, and we are going to be listening to that a little bit later. And I will be giving my thoughts and giving some feedback on the cue. If you want to skip over that and you're watching this on YouTube, then you can skip over by clicking on the timestamps in the description below. So today's topic, this is something that I get asked kind of frequently, and it always pops up over on the 52 Cues community and in other communities, and it's the idea of output. How much output should you be focusing on if you're wanting to be a working composer? And this is one of the things that 52 Cues is all about. And it's one of the seeds of 52 Cues, which we talked about last week, and I hinted at the idea that if you write just one cue per week, then you are on your way towards making a sustainable career. This is a concept that was introduced in Dan Graham's book, A Composer's Guide to Library Music, and I will put a link to Dan's book below. And I'm going to be working on getting an interview with Dan because I have so much I want to ask him about the process, but be on the lookout for that. He's one of my upcoming interviews, and so be on the lookout for that. But the idea, 52 Cues is motivation and inspiration to get going, to get out of your rut, or to get up into the studio or get behind a keyboard and just start writing music and focusing on writing at least one publishable one cue per week. And so what do I mean when I say publishable? That means that it has all of the components that a library is going to be looking for. And we're not going to do a super deep dive into that, although that's a really good idea. I'm going to make a note of that. What do libraries look for? I'm going to make a note of that, and we'll do that on an upcoming topic. But outputting at least one cue per week, which for me is a starting point. It's not necessarily the end point, but a starting point. One polished, finished, mixed, mastered cue ready for publication, has all the components that a music editor or a music supervisor is looking for, and is accepted and published into a library or into a catalog. Now, this sparked a really pretty epic debate over at vi-control.net, and someone, I'm not sure who this is, and I'm not even sure if this user is a member of the 52 family. If you are a member of the 52 Cues Facebook group, please let me know, and my apologies if I missed that disconnect. But my episode that I wrapped up 2021 with was I wrote one cue per week, and here is my story. This is what I learned. And this launched an 8-page debate about how much should you be writing. And for some, writing 1 cue per week was great. For others, I mean, here's a composer said, I think he meant 52 cues per month through the whole year, thinking that, I'm writing, one or two cues a day. And other composers talked about how much should you have, and one of the main things that kind of came out of it was the difference between a film composer and a production music composer, and what their output really, really looks like. And I want to make that distinction first because for film composers, a cue might be a 30-second chunk of music. A cue might be a 2-minute bed with just some strings and some light piano as it is underscore. Most cues for films, you know, are using a similar palette of sounds. And a composer, when they sit down to write a film score, they'll kind of establish the sound palette, a la Bob Ross. I've got my little Bob Ross here, and they've got the little palette of colors, and then they're going to compose their score using those same palettes of colors. So when you're watching videos, when you're watching tutorials, when you're watching a composer talk about their process, and they're coming from film composer land, and they talk about having a template, that's with that's the output in mind for that. They're thinking, I have all of these sounds set up and I'm going to be using them over and over and over. And so I'm going to set up a template with all the sounds that I need so that I can just jump into writing. And that's all well and good. But for production music composers, that doesn't quite ring as true, because production music composers often find ourselves having to write relatively, compared to some film music. And I'm not talking about, big epic John Williams type film music, but compared to, a 30-second cue that might underscore a transition between scenes, production music can be pretty dense and can be very complete, complete with fleshed out melodic ideas, complete with harmonic motion. If you were to take a film cue, a 30-second film cue straight from the soundtrack, and try to give it to a library or catalog, it would probably get rejected, because that film cue had a very specific purpose that isn't as flexible and malleable as the library would need. And so if a library is looking for a cue which is just some pads and a tinkly piano, what they're probably going to do is lift those stems from a denser piece of library music, which means that sometimes library music and production music cues can take longer to write. And so looking at the discussion on the VI control, so many film composers are like, wow, I scored a 22 episode TV show in 12 weeks, and it was they hated it because it was just soul crushing in terms of the output and sleeping in your studio, and it's just kind of like all or nothing sometimes with some of these TV schedules. Production music composers, we rarely find ourselves up against that type of an intense deadline. 12 weeks to write 22 episodes of music, and it might be an hour show, and that hour might have 30 minutes of music. So writing, 30 minutes of music, or writing an hour of music a week, seems super overwhelming to me. Maybe that's one of the reasons the universe has kept me from being a film composer. I don't know, but but differentiating between the needs of the film composer, or the needs of a film, versus the needs of the production music catalog. And so let's start with that. So as you're watching these videos, as you're watching composers do their thing, make sure that you know what the output is. I'm a big fan of Christian Henson's YouTube channel, and he is a film composer. Sure, some of the things carry over. Some of the concepts, uh, some of the overall kind of career advice absolutely carries over. But some of it is pretty specific to film, and just like this channel is very specific towards production music. So if I'm sitting here telling you you can build a career writing just 52 cues a year to get you started, and you're from the film land, that feels completely bonkers. Because in the film composer world, a cue might be 30 seconds. And if you're just writing, what is that? 26 minutes of music a year. Can you make a career out of that as a film composer? Probably not. But make sure that you understand the messenger and the output. And so seeing that big discussion over at VI Control was really kind of eye-opening for me and helped me really think, okay, this is this lane, this is that lane, and there's another lane for game composers. There's another lane for songwriters. Songwriters might take months to finish an album of 10 or 12 songs. Production music composers will probably spend a month or maybe two to finish 12 cues, three if you're doing one per week. Whereas a film composer might, you know, write 22 episodes of music in 12 weeks. Maybe go completely crazy and and malnourished by the end of it, but that's their prerogative, and I think that goes along with it. Just like in games, the crunch and the output drive. So as a production music composer, I like being able to adjust my own output and scale it depending on what clients need, what clients are asking for, and my own creative motivation, discipline, procrastination. I, as a as a production music composer, I like being much more in control of that. Film composers don't really get that luxury. Game composers don't get that luxury. Songwriters get that luxury even more than production music composers because songwriters are writing songs and their only motivation is how many songs can I sell to you, to the fans. They're not necessarily thinking in terms of sync. Now, once you start thinking in sync and placements on TV, then now suddenly someone else becomes the decision maker. And you have to get right with that if you are a creative in the media industry. Somebody else gets to call the shots. Somebody else gets to assign value to your work. Songwriters way over here, not necessarily caring about sync. That's all well and good. You go do your thing. For media composers, film, game, production music composers, somebody else gets to assign that value. And that can be challenging for some. So, how much should you focus on? Well, I would say write at whatever pace doesn't burn you out, doesn't crush your spirit, doesn't torch relationships, doesn't, I don't want to say ruin your life, but in the long term, you want to be able to write in a way that is sustainable. I'm all about sustainability and creating a sustainable career. And if you are torching relationships, if you are torching your body, if you are torching your networking, if you're torching your equipment, then that's not sustainable. It's just not for a career of 20, 30, 40 years. Yeah, you can do that short term, but it's not a long-term solution. And so write at whatever pace is sustainable with the idea that you do want to increase your output. Because at some point, When production music land, it is a game of numbers at some point. It's, you're not making millions of dollars off of one play. You're not making hundreds of $1,000s off of one play or one cue. A songwriter over here, with all the creative freedom and everything that we talked about, a songwriter can write an album, have one hit, quote unquote, that gets tons of air, that gets tons of play, and they tour it and it gets streamed millions and millions and millions of times. And there's a whole discussion about royalties for streaming, but we'll talk about that on another show. But they can control that, and they can have their album get millions of streams, and that's what they're looking for. They're looking for that home run. For production music composers, we're not necessarily looking for a home run. What we're looking, to continue my baseball metaphor, we're looking to just get on base. We just want to get on base every single time. And so while we might not score, we're getting success every time we round a different base. So no, you're not going to get millions and millions and millions of hits off of one track. But if you can get hundreds or thousands of hits out of hundreds of cues, then now the economy of scale starts kicking in, and you can kind of see how you could make a sustainable living out of this. But it takes a lot of cues floating around. You might get lucky. You might get lucky with a handful of cues, and I've experienced this, a handful of cues that get a lot of traction. I had a handful of cues that showed up for several years in golf broadcast on CBS Sports. It was great. The royalties were great, but eventually they will move on to other cues, and that's the nature of the business. Which means that I can't just kind of sit back and say, "Okay, I've done my job. Now I can go and do something else, or I can just flitter on to another flower." I have to keep writing, because the music supervisors are going to keep looking for new music. And if I don't keep feeding them new music, then they're going to choose someone else. And that is what's happened. I had, like I said, lots of play on golf, picked up these other clients, these other libraries that got the bulk of my attention, and just kind of trickled some cues on back to CBS. And I'm not getting nearly as much play in the last couple of years. Now, I don't know if some of that is pandemic induced, or I don't know about any of that, but my job is to keep feeding that beast while feeding a new beast. Dance with the girl, what brought you to the dance? Dance with the girl, what brought you? And that's one of the things that I have to keep telling myself, and one of the things that I keep working on. So it does require a hefty output. Does it require one cue per day for an entire year? I would, even in production music world, where it is, I don't want to say formulaic, but there is an element to we're treading over very familiar territory, let's say. But being able to output, one cue per day, let's say 100 cues, no, not 100 cues, 300 cues a year. Ooh, I don't know. I would be interested to see a composer's catalog with that kind of output, 3, 4, 500 cues per year. And if this is you, I'd love to hear from you, and kind of compare how many of those are all super similar, and is the quality up to par? I don't know. That'd be interesting. I'd be interested to see that and to hear that. And if that's you, like I said, I want to hear from you. My goal was 3 cues per week, which puts me at about 156 cues. Now, I think that's, over the last couple of years, especially doing 52 cues, that's been kind of where my sweet spot is, 3 cues. I've had weeks where I've submitted 0 cues in 1 week. And I've had weeks where I've submitted 13 cues. Did I write 13 cues from scratch in 1 week? No. But 13 cues in various stages of production all kind of converged to where I like blitzed my publisher with 13 cues in 1 week. Yup. So 3 cues on average feels like my sweet spot. I want to push that more, but I I'm not sure. Well, I know I would not be able to sustain like 1 cue per day. Nope. I just can't. Maybe if I worked full time, and maybe that's a factor I need to consider. Do you work full time? Are you a full time composer and that's all you do for 8 hours a day? Sit down. But even during vacation days, and even when I do have days which are I am a full time composer, it's not like I can sit down and write for 8 straight hours. I'm wrangling emails, I'm doing networking stuff, I am filling out metadata, or I'm working on exports, bounces, I'm uploading to libraries, I'm researching, I'm practicing my craft, I'm learning about new plugins. And so it's not like I could sit down and write for 8 hours a day. I can write for a couple of hours a day, 2 or 3 hours per day, yes. But if it takes 6 to 8 hours to finish a queue, then it's going to take 2 or 3 days to finish 1 queue. That's been my output. But if you are focusing first on quantity and just cranking out queue after queue, I would wager that the quality wouldn't necessarily be there. That would be my guess. And that might be somewhat incendiary to say, but I know for me, as soon as I really start like cranking them out, then I don't feel great. Either the polish of each cue isn't there, or they're not as fresh and original as I want them to be. Right. And both of those things affect quality. When I was getting towards the end of writing my third album of dramedy cues, hip hop dramedy cues, by the end of it, I was on fumes and I felt like I had nothing else to say in this genre for now. And so I found myself like going back to that first album and what's an idea here that I can stretch even further. And so the end of that album didn't feel as fresh and original, at least to me, as the end of the third album didn't feel as fresh and original as the beginning of the first album. So either you are creatively wrung out or you're cutting corners, production corners. You're not spending as much time mixing. You're not spending as much time, working the EQs or finessing expression curves. I mean, because there's only so many hours in the day. Or you're not the cues aren't as dense as they need to be, or they're not as developed musically as they need to be. Right? You're shorting the system some way. At least I keep saying you statements. Really, these are I statements. So don't misunderstand me. These are all I statements. So quality versus quantity. I believe that quantity builds towards quality and you get to a tipping point, or let's not say even say a tipping point. I think you get to an equilibrium. Yes, there's the word. You get towards an equilibrium where you can balance the quality versus quantity. You feel good about your output. You're starting to get placements. You're getting things, published in catalogs. You're starting to see royalties come in, and your output is where it needs to be to keep feeding those machines that are going to take your cues and work them in through their system. For me, that equilibrium is around 3 cues per week. For you, that might be different. You might be starting and 1 cue per week is that stasis point. You might be 5 cues per week. And if you are 5 cues per week, I definitely want to hear from you. I definitely want to hear your story. I want to hear about the things that you do to keep that production up, keep the quality where it needs to be, keep the originality and the creativity where it needs to be, and keep your time, life, work, relationship balance. I definitely want to hear from you. Let me know in the comments below. Love to hear from you. So we're going to have links to that vicontrol.net article. Definitely want to check that out. Like I said, it's 8 pages long, and I chime in on a couple of times. And again, love to know your thoughts. Please let me know in the comments below. So let's change gears. I want to play for you. This is a cue written by a 52 Cues family member over at the 52 Cues Facebook group. This is Caravan by Angel Jimenez. It's a tension cue, and we're going to take a listen to it, and then I'm going to give my feedback as we go, with the idea that this would be a production music cue, and if I'm approaching this as a library or a music supervisor. So let's take a listen. Yeah, I'm liking this so far. The first thing I noticed right out of the gate is you want to make sure that you clean up that intro. It's like almost 2 complete seconds before the sound comes in. Yeah, over 2, almost 2.5 seconds. So you're going to want to tighten that up to make sure that on one hand we do want a clean start to it. I give about 200 milliseconds, and that was something that was recommended by a library, actually. Give a 200 millisecond lead in. That gives enough time for any MIDI or whatever to kind of catch up, but isn't so long. So right now, it feels that feels too long. All right, so now I'm going to stop talking and actually listen to the cue itself. Nice. Ooh, I like the guitar harmonics. Can you make those harmonics ring out a little bit longer? There's some panning going on. Yeah, that one, boom, boom, that one kind of popped off to the left. I would be a little bit more deliberate with that if you're going to do some panning business, which is always a tough thing because we don't want to overly pan. This has been my experience. We don't want to overly pan things on a stereo image for production music because this is going to be, laying behind dialogue and everything else. So we generally want to play it a little safe and not get too fancy with panning business. But if you're going to do it, then be a little bit more deliberate with it. Meaning, what I mean by deliberate is maybe use it a little bit more often earlier in the cue so that the expectation is established that this is a sound that's kind of moving across the stereo field versus it sounding like an error. Like, oh, hey, this is kind of off to the left all of a sudden. Because right now things feel kind of in the center, which is good. I think I can feel it moving. That one jumps out on me, though. That one jumps out. I like that drone. I would pull that down maybe in the mix a little bit. Ooh, nice. It's really sibilant up there. And being 48, I've lost much above 18K, so I can imagine what it might sound like. That feels a little too crisp. I do like the wide stereo things with all the gravelly sound. Kind of felt like I lost the pulse a little bit. Two, three, four, 1, 2, 3. Yeah, some weird phrasing. I would maybe make that even greater, like make that stop, make that a really clear edit point. I do like having the edit point, but maybe make it a little bit more pronounced. That would give an editor more time to work with it. Like, let's see. 1, 2, bum, 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 bum. Yeah, try to keep things phrased as normally as possible. Try to keep it very consistent. This feels like a pretty hard right turn here, and I would keep some of these pads, these sustained elements throughout here. Like we have some new sounds that we really haven't heard from. Tear Down the Walls likes the big change there. I can hear some of it. It just feels like a real departure. Which isn't inherently bad, but we don't want to depart really hard for a really long period of time. That's what we have to be careful about. We've gone for a really long time without hearing our primary melody, almost 30 seconds. The really ding, 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 ding. That's a fantastic melody. And we're hinting at it, but I feel like we've abandoned it too long. And this is one of the instances where production music and songwriting and film, this is where those things kind of diverge. Because things you can get away with in film music or writing a song, you really don't want to do, because you run the risk of changing the mood. Remember, library music composers publishers and editors, they're looking for one cue to really kind of establish a mood, and then that mood being carried throughout the entire cue. And so as soon as we start changing things up by pulling the melody away for, a minute, or changing rhythmic elements or harmonic elements or textural, the sounds that are getting used for a long period of time, then it shifts the mood of the cue away from where it first was when the editor first chose it. And remember, if an editor has a scene that changes moods, they're not necessarily looking for one cue that represents that mood change. They're going to look for two cues, one cue for mood A, one cue for mood B, and then they're going to edit those together. So we want to make sure that our cues are sustaining and maintaining one mood or emotion throughout the cue. And I'm not saying that's what we have going on here. I don't think we've really changed the mood, but we've definitely changed the character. this cue, this part feels, this feels one way. This doesn't feel necessarily like a continuation of what we established. Or what's really happening here is this is the cue, this is the vibe of the cue, and what we have is a 1:10 intro, which is too long as an intro. If I'm thinking of it that way, that makes sense. That makes compositional sense to me. That this business here is an intro into where the cue is going to go. But I like this. I like this melody. I like the use of all of the harmonics. I would probably cycle through the phrase a couple of times. Maybe one more time. Maybe hint at it. Bing, 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 bing. Maybe hint at the melody. Then really bring them all together. But it just feels like the character of the cue after the edit point has changed and never really kind of goes back. I mean, the harmonic structure is there. And it doesn't feel like it really energetically progresses either. I would look at adding additional layers and really build that up. Oh, I like that little sound. I would put that little bong right there at the button. Not sure that crash cymbal. I'm not really sure about that because that sound wasn't necessarily part of the textural palette that we have established. I maybe back it down in the mix, maybe pitch it down a little bit. It kind of stands out for me. But we've got some really, really good things happening. It feels a little long. I think we could shave off one phrase. I definitely am a bigger fan of the first half of this cue rather than the second half of the cue, because this is nice. This is really, really nice. And I think bringing in some of these earlier elements here, shaving off maybe one phrase, maybe treating one or two phrases as kind of a breakdown and then pushing it together and really, really bringing them together, I think could be very, very cool. But ultimately, I really like it. I like your sound choices and really solid melody. Thank you, Angel, for submitting that. I really, really appreciate it. Like I said, this was submitted over at the 52 Cues Facebook group, and where every week we post up a thread about, hey, what are you writing this week? And this was a week 2 submission. And if you want to be a part of that, you can head over to the Facebook group at 52cues.com or facebook.com/groups/52cues, and maybe you can have your cue presented over or here on the podcast. So that's going to do it for me today. Thank you so much for joining me. I really, really do appreciate it. And I also want to give a special word of thanks once again to my Patreon patrons whose support helps keep everything going here. To be a patron, it's just $1 a month, and you not only get the satisfaction of knowing that you're helping the 52 Cues community and helping the channel, but you also have access to my weekly music production live streams. Now, if you're not interested in that at all, you don't have to. You don't even have to subscribe to the channel and all of that stuff, but it is an opportunity for you to give back if you want to do that. Like I said, we do weekly music production live streams, and last Last year, we wrote 35 cues, and I've already started. We've already got one cue in the can for 2022. So if you want to see how those cues are all made, then you can join the Patreon and get access to all of those archives. But that's going to do it for me this week. Thank you for joining me, and I hope that you had a really good week 2 in 2022, and we will see you next time. Until then, peace. The 52 Cues podcast is copyright 2022 Dave Croft, all rights reserved. The music played on the podcast is copyright of their respective owners and is used for educational purposes only. For more information, including joining the 52 Cues community and submitting your cue for consideration on the podcast, head over to 52cues.com.